Welcome back to the LS Community Church podcast. We're in Lee Summit, Missouri, and Lee Summit Community Church is all about making disciple makers who saturate Lee Summit with the gospel. And we are glad that you've joined us on this podcast, part 2 of Act 5, The Most Interesting Man in the World. And speaking of interesting men,
Corbett's here.
Corbett and Stan, thank you guys.
And Kevin.
And Kevin.
All right.
And Kevin, you're here
that.
too.
Thanks for, it's a whole lot more interesting right here, right? I mean, the shirt says it all.
Well, it's pretty interesting behind the scenes over there too.
It is.
Where people can't see.
Yeah,
it's
right. This is
interesting
true.
back
this
there
is
too.
True. Okay, so story series. This is a story series podcast. And in these story series podcasts, we kind of recap or actually preview. That's what it is. It's a preview of each one of these acts as we're going through the story. And so if you're looking for previous series previews, just go back and look for story series podcasts. They're labeled a little bit differently in all of our podcasts that we've got there. Right now for this one, we're getting into part 2 of The Most Interesting Man in the World. So part 1, we talked about kingdom ethics and a few other things. What are some other things we talked about?
Galilee, the social element.
Social elements.
Not whitewashing Jesus.
Not whitewashing Jesus. So much more for us to talk about. And before we push record on this, Dan, you had something good to say. Just there's no way in a couple of podcast episodes that we're going to hit everything.
No
way we're hitting everything.
Not with Jesus, especially.
Not with Jesus.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't even know where to go back to, but part of my thought goes to so we're a few guys. We primarily help to teach and preach at this church, and it's so now we're having these conversations around Jesus, and a lot of these conversations, I would say, are really interesting to us. They go into topics that we're really passionate about talking about, growing in, learning. But then my mind always goes to you, the listener, the subscriber. And, are we hitting the mark for you? And what are you thinking about? What are you wrestling with? What questions do you have? And so part of it is that I crave the feedback because I'm hey, are we hitting the mark for you? But also just the remembrance of man, we've got, 20, 30, 40 minutes, whatever it is. And you've got to try to sum up the life of Jesus. And the reality is there's really not a very good way for us to do that. Yeah. So we're hitting these high level topics, social Galilee stuff, kingdom ethics, missiology, soteriology, kind of these big things, and trying to bring them down a little bit and just have a conversation around them. So I'd love to hear from you, the viewer, partly, but also hope you enjoy part of the conversation as we try to unpack literally the most interesting man in the world, Jesus.
So this particular series, from the birth of Jesus to the resurrection of Jesus.
Yep.
So let's talk a little soteriology. Why the cross? What is soteriology? Yeah.
Yeah. So becomes the ology part is logos. It's the word, or it's really where you get the study of.
Study.
Yeah. And then soteriology, that's of salvation, right? So we're studying salvation. And I think the best way to consider one is to say that we can't do, this is what I used to tell my students, we can't do Christology, the study of person work of Jesus Christ, without soteriology in mind, right? And so even the fact that we broke them into 2 parts, because it's necessary. We're doing one with looking forward to the other. We're doing one with looking back to the other as well. I think they work together. But it's really just trying to unpack, okay, so all right, we confess as Christians that there's something that happened on the cross at Calvary with Jesus in his death and then resurrection, right? And again, it's both ands, right? It's not just the cross, it's the empty tomb.
Yes.
It's the resurrected Lord. And then there's, fast forward to the ascension too. But there's something that happens there. And what we're trying to wrestle with is, okay, but how does that work? That's really what we're saying. How do we understand it? Because I think we grow up with it. We hear it in Sunday school for those who have gone. There is a theology that we have baked in. We have a soteriology. We just may not know what it is or that it has a name other than, it's just salvation. And we take it on faith and we move on to the next topic. So that's kind of what it is and trying to unpack it. And I think it's actually quite helpful to understand, because when you think about I like the theological system that we create in our minds, whether we know it or not, like how we understand God's work on the cross in Jesus can influence how we view so many other things around that, and how we engage with the world, and how we engage with Jesus, how we engage with, just liturgically, religiously, ecclesially, et cetera. So it's helpful to kind of understand how the church has been wrestling this for hundreds of years.
Well, I mean, I was just waiting for you to keep going. I was hoping you just started leaning in.
Well, I mean, how far back you want to go, right? Like,
well, I don't know how.
So I guess maybe just think about there are a couple like classical ones, right? And we'll just start with maybe the most classical. So we'll go back. The one that kind of starts it all is soteriology is called Christus Victor, and this is like a whole migration pattern through languages. That's Latin for Christ the Victor, and really it gets penned in 1931. It's much older than that, right? But that's where the name comes from, and it's a retelling effectively of the creation and the fall. Like that's kind of what's in mind is trying to think through, okay, so what happens on the cross? And it goes back to the garden. It says, okay, Adam and Eve are created innocent. They're perfect. It's great. They were given one rule, right? And it's like, don't eat from the tree of knowledge. Boop, sorry. Yeah. But what happens is that they break the law because they get tricked by the devil. Like that, this is how Christus Victor works. They get tricked into doing it. And so God looks and he goes, well, God could act. He could step in. He could fix things. Right? It's not saying that he can't. He could. But he doesn't, because, at least not directly, because he thinks that, there is some justice in what's happened because they have sinned. They have broken the rules. So God does act, but he acts in a different way. He actually works through the person of Jesus. And so here comes the incarnation. And it's kind of a parallelism of what happens, because to some extent, God tricks Satan with Jesus, right? So God enters in the flesh. He's this sinless human, and the devil's really intrigued. He's like, well, what's going on here? Can I trick him? Because I mean, to everybody else, right? Like that's what he's looking at. And it doesn't work. Well, at some point, Satan gets so, frustrated that he now breaks the rules and he kills Jesus. Like this is how Christus Victor works. And because of that, all of a sudden God says, nope, that's an injustice, right? So to restore the justice, you have the resurrection. And that frees everyone. And that breaks the bonds of Satan, right? So that's Christus Victor kind of in a nutshell. And again, if you may think back and think about your Sunday school or how you thought through it, you may have heard the phrase and assumed it meant something different, but that's kind of the way in which it gets walked through classically. And this another way of saying this outside of soteriology, which is a real fancy word for what we're talking about. But the other one is just to call these atonement theories, right? Yeah. So there's multiple, a quick Google search, you can find at least 7 that are pretty kind of just classic kind of views of like, what happened at the cross? What is this with this guy, Jesus, the incarnation, Galilee, and miracles and feeding of the hungry, and all these things are going on. Now, all of a sudden he's on a cross and you're going, something happened there. What is it exactly? And what's interesting is that, and I'm always interested in this conversation with you, because for those who are really like, clued in on some of this language, I'm not a real great systematic theologian, because I see too many, like, there's some truth over here, and there's some truth in this thought, and there's some truth in this theory, and there's truth in this. And then each one has a verse or two that backs it up. And I'm like, all of these things to some degree can be accurate to some degree, right? So there's a little bit of like benefit in the multiple theories. It's why I've told people, this is a conversation for another time, but I've said for a long time, I'm a Calvinian, because like there are stories and examples and verses in the Bible that do tend to kind of line up with your like Calvinist kind of Reformed theology type stuff. But there's also these verses that make it sure feel like I've got a choice in the matter. And so what do you do with these that both kind of go against each other? Now, systematic theology would say, well, you've got to try to force that all into like a way of thinking. And I'm sitting there kind of going, I struggle with that, because I feel like, you've kind of got both there. So I'm just kind of curious what some of the other atonement theories are, if you want to put a few of them out there. Yeah. So again, to harken back to part 1, if you picked up part 2, you need to go back and give it a go. But context is, again, helpful,
Yes.
right? And it's the context in which we do theology. Because what happens is that you fast forward into like the medieval period, and you have a person like Anselm, and he comes out with the atonement theory, satisfaction theory of atonement. And again, part of this is because he doesn't like Christus Victor. Like, I mean, that's really kind of the point of it. And he's looking in his, kind of medieval feudal like system, right? Like that's the social construct and it's chivalry. And so in that context, it's all about honor and dishonor, right? Like that's the point of it. And so he starts to process atonement theory through that view, which is that this is about, kind of God's honor has been, tarnished.
Yeah.
And so it has to be followed by either satisfaction or punishment, right? So that becomes like the framework that he's working through. And I always thought, like, think of it this way. And I think this helps to kind of maybe frame Anselm a little bit. Let's say you're on vacation. Someone breaks into your house and they totally ransack it, right? Like they cover it in, I don't know, Broncos wallpaper. They spray paint your dog in silver and black, right? Like, they do all the things, right? Okay. Then they take all of your stuff, right? All of your stuff is gone.
Oh, man.
And okay, so you come home and you're like, okay, well, what do you do? Right? Like you start trying to find the criminal, and you find all of a sudden all your stuff on Facebook Marketplace. The cops show up and they've got the criminal. Okay. So what are your options? Now, again, this isn't a modern context, right? Do you just let them go? You're like, whatever, just let it be. I'm like, well, no, because again, like what justice is in that? And kind of fast forward into this idea of atonement theory and God. It's like, well, that makes God sound like a big softy. We can't do that. So that's not a good option. What's the next one? Well, punish them, right? They should be punished more than what I've suffered. So go burn their house to the ground. Like, we're going to go big or go home.
Yeah.
Or do you come back and say there's some reasonable amount of punishment? And so you kind of go down that path because crime should be punished. But then all of a sudden the criminal, wants to repay you somehow, right? Saying I'm sorry isn't enough, but there's got to be something. They want to make satisfaction for the mistake they've made. That's what they're trying to do. And so that's kind of the mindset of thinking about it's either they're going to get punished or they need to somehow satisfy you, right? And so that's the context. And so it's, that's the piece we start to look at. All right, well, from God's perspective, right, this is where we go, is that Adam and Eve sin, right? Okay, now a debt needs to be paid to God. And so satisfaction needs to be made. The problem is that Adam and Eve already owe everything to God because they've sinned. It's infinite. They can't do it, but they must repay to God, but yet they can't do anything that only God can do. So they're at this impasse. And so thus we need Jesus. And the Latin they use is duus homo, a God man is needed. And because Jesus is sinless, he owes nothing to God. And yet he can satisfy it as in place of, he did that satisfaction for God on behalf of Adam and Eve. So that's Anselm and this satisfaction theory. And again, it's part of it bleeds out of he's not really keen on Christus Victor, and he looks at his own context and says, all right, how do we understand the cross in this mindset? Yeah.
Did you have some?
But I'm listening. I'm like you. I'm listening. I'm thinking of my upbringing. You talk about culture, the culture in which I grew up in. You kind of alluded to this in part one, and this kind of substitutionary atonement theology that I was taught. That Jesus had to be punished in substitution for my sin, and that's really what it comes down to. And we'll get into this here in a minute, but I think it's important to realize the effect that our theology has on how we go about fulfilling the mission of Jesus. We'll talk about it here in a minute, but the history behind penal substitutionary theory.
It's Corbett's favorite theory.
Yeah,
to be honest.
Yeah.
No, don't chase that rabbit. I'm not the scholar in the room, but it does come down to this idea that God is, kind of, he's the wrathful God, the there's
cosmic cop that's
cosmic bully, cannot wait to smite you for the mistake. And then Jesus shows up, lives a perfect life. And it is, God just absolutely crushes him and, loves every minute of it. And it's, somebody had to pay the price. And this is one of those things where I think that it's the same thing as what we were talking about in part one in our conversation with so many of these things, like the kingdom language, so much more holistic, and it's bigger than just that, right? It's not just substitutionary atonement stuff. There's an element. I mean, this is why it's weird for me, because you've got an element of it where Jesus dies to reconcile us back to the Father, right? 2 Corinthians 5 is in the Bible. So, I mean, you got to deal with that because he dies in our place. Like, there's that language in there. But to just limit it to that begins to now affect how you see God, how you follow God, how you hear God. If the only thing you can think of God is just the giant cosmic bully waiting to smite you, which is really interesting, because if Jesus becomes the perfect sacrifice, atonement, scapegoat theory, which I kind of like that one just because of the image of the Old Testament and the scapegoat and all that stuff. If God really does have all of his wrath satisfied in Jesus, how in the world do we as Christians somehow land at this place of, well, there was a hurricane, so therefore God is unleashing wrath on people? Now, wait a minute. You said he unleashed it on Jesus so that people could, he was the substitute. How is God still wrathful? And so I think that theory, if you really play it out, there's a lot more question marks with it that don't make a lot of sense to me. But there is a fullness in, for me at least, and maybe stealing a few from each of the pieces and going, God is up to something at the cross. God is doing something. And it's kind of there's a bit of a mystery in some of that for us as well, which I think makes Christianity that much greater. But
I would agree. And I teach systematic theology, but the longer I teach it, I would say that I find kind of Augustine's kind of statement of like, hold loosely to the things that you have, like, and echoing more and more in my mind of like, yes, you build this system to try to make sense of things, like, but it's like a colander.
Hold it loose.
You do, because as you learn things and you read new things, you have to kind of reevaluate them. And you've got, I mean, we don't have time. I mean, you could keep going. You said at least 7. There's more. You've got Abelard's moral influence theory, which I know you absolutely love. But actually, what came to mind was 2 things, right? So if you think about it, just maybe as a mechanism to bring it back to like, okay, frankly, so what? Right. I don't make that phrase loosely. Right. But I'm listening to this podcast. I'm like, okay, so that's interesting. Is that all that it is? I think there's 2 things. One is just more of an interesting nugget, is to say the next time you're in church and you're in worship, listen to the songs we sing. Listen to the old hymns. You will find atonement theory in that. Oh yeah. Right. Just thinking about what we've talked about, of like how we view, what God is or isn't doing, what Jesus is doing, like how you approach that. Atonement theory is very much embedded within much of our worship, right? So there's just an interesting piece, like listen to it next time. Be like, oh, hadn't heard that.
I can think of a lot of hymns that, I mean, for sure, are
blue or red.
Red. All right. Red hymnal only.
All right. So that's the one thing. The other one too, that I think that I didn't think of, and I'm thankful I didn't, because again, my contextual upbringing didn't force me to, is that how we view God, how we talk about God from an atonement theory, in some cases, people are going to use that framework or those words or that imagery. We talk about God as our Heavenly Father. And just keep that in mind in the sense of like what your Father is or isn't doing, and how you draw parallels to the father figure you did or didn't have in your life, what a father figure should or shouldn't be in your life. Like there's a lot in there just to think about. We use that language and people draw parallels, and there's a real impact. And that people could come into our church, people who listen to this podcast going, wow, like that's not the father figure I want. This cosmic bully who just, delights in smiting me. Yeah. Right. Is that really the God that we're talking about? And there's so much more to it than just a simple soundbite like that. But I think that's an element just to be mindful of as to how we.
It's true though. It's a piece of baggage that people do carry in with them based on their context, their story, their history. Like, yeah, it absolutely affects how people even hear the gospel, hear what we're talking about. I mean, it has to be considered to some degree because it's a part of dealing with people.
Indeed. And all of it, you said it, like hear the gospel, but it also then affects like how we actually live out that gospel.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, how we live, whatever the mission is.
So that gets into the missiology conversation. Who's in, who's out? You know, how do we determine who's saved, whatever that means, and who's not? And oh boy, here we go. So let's talk about some missiology. Who's in, who's out? How do we determine that?
Well, sort of like with the word about soteriology, right? It's the study of salvation theories, these atonement theory things, right? So missiology is kind of the study of mission, the learning of the mission of Jesus. And I think from my perspective anyway, it's important to remember that from my seat, I would say God is a God who is on mission for something. God is not just randomly doing things. He is intentionally moving things in a very specific direction. I believe we've seen that through the Old Testament, that God is, and we get to Act 5 now, like God is trying to get us to Jesus. Like there's a purpose to all these things. And then you get to Jesus. We've already talked about this, introducing his ministry and going through the Sermon on the Mount. Part of the Sermon on the Mount was, blessed is the one who does this. And so it's there's some kind of a follow-up that is expected of us. You read on through the rest and you get to one of the most famous parts is the Great Commission in Matthew 28, right? And we typically read it just as, go therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptize them, teach them to observe. And I think that's an important element, right? Teach them to obey or observe all the things I have taught you. And so there's something in the mission of Jesus where he doesn't just show up to, just one-off satisfy an angry God, and then we just kind of go forward and, hey, thanks for that, and then we just do whatever we want kind of a thing. There's actually a missional response, a way that we live, and to our point through the Sermon on the Mount and all those types of things. So the question of who's in and who's out, first of all, I would argue is a bad question and also not our job to answer. Mm-hmm. I think that that's one of those things that is actually up to God to answer. I'm not sure that we fully, truly know. So I think the way we wrestle through some of these things, we should be careful about, to that point, creating that. But there's really interesting thought process or tool, if you want to call it that, in missiology that talks about this idea of boundary set versus center set. And the boundary set idea is, I think, typically where most Christians live. Most Christians live at this place of there's a boundary. The cross is in the middle of it. I'm a good Christian person. I go to church and I sing some songs and I give sometimes and whatever. So I'm a good Christian person who's inside the box. And everybody else outside who doesn't do things the way I think they should be doing it, those people are outside and they're doomed. Like they're, good luck in hell, buddy, and it just kind of a wash my hands of it. And there's a boundary to like who I'm going to engage and connect with. It's part of how Christians have created so many subcultures, right? We have the subculture of subculture t-shirts, subculture bracelets, subculture this, subculture music, subculture. It's all these things. We have to create this stuff so that it fits in our boundary because we can't be a part of what's happening out here. So it's all fitting in here. What it also does is raise the wall so that we can't get to people. They can't get to us. There's this barrier to how we engage with people. And if they even see they can be a part of us or if we're a part of them, and we end up really shooting ourselves in the foot when we do that. I think we're seeing it play out currently today in 2025 in the United States. The other side of boundary set is just center set. Center set says there's no boundary. There's a cross in the middle and my life is oriented around the cross. every single day, I'm not perfect. I don't always do it right. I don't always, sometimes I mess it up. Sometimes I get it right, whatever. But typically my life is revolving around the life and the teachings of Jesus. I'm typically centered around the cross. But everybody else is also in this same kind of life thing too. They may not necessarily be centered around the cross yet, but we're all kind of trying to figure it out together. Like I'm in it with them. And I think what that thinking does is it opens the door for us to be better, super kind of churchy language here, like us being the missionary to people, as opposed to expecting everybody to be the missionary to me. You clean yourself up, get yourself right with God first, then you can come in. That's going back to Galilee. That's the opposite way that Jesus does it. That is not a thing. He doesn't approach it that way. And so from a mission perspective, if Christians could remove the boundary and get to this place of like, hey, how do we engage in this conversation more broadly? I think from a mission perspective, at least we'd be in a much healthier place.
So if you're listening to this and this sounds awkward, right? Because it does. I think there's a couple of things maybe just to call out and all that. First of all, the boundary set or bounded set, if it feels familiar, I mean, just to be honest, right? That's how the Western world works.
Yep.
Right. Like, and because of that, over especially the last 150 years, right? Likely, if you grew up in the West, your theological framework is defined by that. There are rules, right? Like,
yeah.
How do you know you're a good Christian? You do this, you do all the things, you go to church, right? Like,
here's your list.
Yeah. Like, that's how you know, right? I said the prayer, I was baptized, X, Y, Z, et cetera, right? Yep. Like, so that's the way the world in general works. That's the framework you probably lived in. And then you hear this idea of centered set, and you're like, oh, that seems weird. And maybe the first thing that comes to mind is you go, oh, what? That feels like we're like, this moral relativism piece. You're like, oh, follow me on my fitness journey. You're like, no, Sharon, you're on Ozempic. Like, that's not a fitness journey. You're like, it's not, that's not it, because that's not that. We are agreeing that there is a center.
Yep.
And that center is Christ.
Yes.
It's, you don't define the center. We are in agreement as to what the center is. Okay. So that's perhaps why, like, some people, first time you hear it, you're like, well, I'm not ready for that. That seems weird.
Yeah, sure.
The other side, just to be fair, is that center set brings uncertainty. And to counter that, boundary set gives certainty. And in some cases, you would say, oh, that's a benefit. I'd also say at the same time, that's also a negative to it. Because we get so focused on the certainty, we can define it. We start to focus on the boundaries themselves rather than the purpose as to why we established the boundaries in the first place. And so the uncertainty focus is like, well, I don't want to look in the abyss behind me. I want to stay focused on Jesus. And no matter where I'm at, kind of in the abyss, I'm always orientated in the right direction. So, I mean, I just think there's a couple of things there and all that to be like, all right, like, sure, it feels weird. It sounds odd. It's not the way the world works, but at least not in the main. But it is still, I mean, we think about it in the context. I think it's helpful just to maybe kind of mentally set it into what might be a challenge, at least initially.
Yes. And I would also just shortly add that if you can really get your head wrapped around that, I think when Jesus says things like, go and make disciples of all nations, and I think if we can think about it slightly differently than we have been, I think the mission of Jesus and how we can do it, because I think most people here make disciples of all nations and they assume that's the missionary's job and it's the pastor's job. And they kind of miss out on the like, no, God has something for me in this. And if you can really open up kind of your worldview to center set, God has a way for me to engage and to kind of hang out in this, and I have a job to do here. I have a mission to do, things to obey, things to do. I think people can actually engage the mission of Jesus a little more.
Well, you're right. As I think about just that that imagery of like a field with, fences around it, right? That becomes the barrier. I can't cross that, to your point. Right. Like, you got to get in here and then I can bring you
come
towards.
Over here and then we can.
But if there is no fence, right, I can go as far as possible. And all I'm doing is finding that person and then kind of tapping the shoulder and helping them turn the right way, and then
to center themselves correctly.
Yes, and then to use a bunch of Christianese language, right, to walk with them towards the right point. Like
Right.
those all are all there. And I would just say the last thing too is back to your question, Kevin. The question of who's in and who's out, I agree with Stan, is the wrong question. And I think the better question and what Centered Set allows us to ask is not who's in and who's out, but how is God being glorified in this? I think if we eradicate that question, it was like, well, who's in and who's out? Sure, it's important, but really, we don't know the answer. Is God being glorified? How is he being glorified in these moments, in these interactions? Whatever they produce, whether they produce someone who says yes to Jesus and they turn towards the cross at the center, or they say, thanks, but no thanks, and they just keep going. Like, the question should be, is God being glorified first and foremost? And I think I just leave it at that and say, well, let's just start there and then kind of work from it.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with that.
That's really good. Yeah, I just think how boundary set just leaves this emptiness to this life. Like, what are we here for? Instead of N.T. Wright says God offers us life after death, you know? And so there's purpose and meaning for why we're here now. And Jesus explained that through Matthew 28. Let's go. Let's help them repent and believe the good news. And that's that turning about and coming toward Jesus, no matter where they are. So that's good. All right. Well, we could have a volume 3, a part 5,
300.
part 8.
Yeah, 3,000.
Yeah, we could keep going.
This was the easy part, Stan said.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want the record to reflect that's not what I said, but not how I worded it. But
Well, and I'm excited that we have a sponsor. Ozempic is sponsoring this podcast.
I was gonna say, apparently we've added sponsorships. Yeah, that was new.
And Tom, Dr. Wright, if you're hearing this, give us a shout. You can follow us too.
Yeah, that would be great, right?
That would be pretty great.
That would be pretty good. All right, most interesting man in the world, part 2. Thanks for joining us, Stan, Corbett. Appreciate you guys
Kevin.
and your input. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks for watching and listening. Be sure to subscribe and like and keep following along. We appreciate you jumping in and joining us. Give us your feedback, what you're learning. Give us some questions. Man, we'd love to follow up on this topic. And we're not bound to just 2. We could have a couple more. We could do this again and again. So give us your feedback. Again, if you're here in the KC area, we'd love to have you join us on Sunday morning, 9:15 and 11 o'clock are our gathering times. And if you're not and you want to keep following along with the story, you can listen to our weekly sermons right here on the podcast. So jump in and keep pace with us. So again, thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.